Fascination. A number of years ago, probably when your grandfather was a little boy, there was another young boy named Jim Monroe who lived alone with his mother. Her name was Sandra, and she was by nature a very pleasant woman. But even so, because of her circumstances, she was harried and somewhat distracted. A few years ago, before our story begins, her husband had been killed in the Korean War, and she was left to provide for and bring up her son and manage the small remains of a once large estate. But that requires more of an explanation, and so I suppose I shall have to give one. Because of the nature of the story, I would like to tell you I cannot say exactly where they lived, but since the story itself will give some things away, I can tell you that it was somewhere in the Tidewater area of southern Maryland or northern Virginia. Beyond this, I am afraid I have to ask you not to be too curious. Honesty also requires that I tell you that I have changed around the names of some of the towns and rivers I mentioned just to help you not be more curious than you should be. So if you have done well in your geography lessons, you will notice some inconsistencies in the following descriptions. But though I have told you not to be, Jim was curious, and that is why I have such an interesting story to tell you. He was not curious about everything, but on a few subjects you have probably not met a more curious boy. His brown eyes were deep and inquisitive, and when it grew long enough to see, he had dark hair. Jim had a pleasant nature, like his mother, but I have to say that he was quite a bit more adventurous. One of the things that fascinated his curious heart more than anything else was the whole subject of pirates. Whenever he had a free moment, his thoughts would drift naturally and easily back to his favorite pirate caves and coves, pirate treasures, pirate battles and crimes, and of course to the great pirate captains. He did not admire them at all, but they did thrill him. On rainy afternoons, especially, he would seek out his favorite books to read and reread some of the stories. You may think that this was just a short enthusiasm. Young boys often have such great interests that only last for a short time and then fall away as soon as they are distracted by another one. But Jim loved his pirate stories faithfully. The interest had come upon him one day in the previous school year when his teacher, Miss Robinson, had mentioned in passing that the great pirate Blackbeard had once landed several miles from where the school was and a very short way from his house. Up to that point, Jim had known a number of pirate stories, just as all boys do, but they had all been simply stories. He had thought of them the same way you might think about Treasure Island, as an exciting story that could never happen anywhere to anyone. But for some reason, the fact that Blackbeard had landed on the banks of a creek just down the road from his house made everything very close and very real, and for the first time an interest in pirates seized Jim by the throat. What used to be remote and distant was now ever present in his imagination. That very afternoon, Jim had checked a book out of the library on Blackbeard, and when he lay in bed reading that night, he came to the story of how Lieutenant Maynard had sailed against Blackbeard down in Caroline and fought a glorious battle with him, bringing the pirate's head back to Virginia, hanging from the bowsprit of his ship. Jim set the book carefully down on the floor beside the bed, turned out the light, and for the next several hours he had been too excited to sleep. Your grandfather and Jim almost certainly never met, but they may have lived in the same kind of house. Jim and his mother lived in a grand old house that the family had built around the turn of the century. It was red colonial brick, but the style was too sturdy and close to the ground to be considered in the colonial style. Though this house was built around 1910, the Monroe family had actually been living somewhere on the same property since the early 18th century. The Monroes had once been very well-to-do, but this was sadly not the case now. This is where the remains of an estate I mentioned earlier come in. In the very early years, the Monroes had been wealthy, but the family fortunes had declined markedly after the war between the states. Even so, they still maintained a respectable place in the community for quite a long time, and when Jim had been born, the estate still had several hundred acres. But after Jim's father had died in the war, the various taxes they had to pay had imposed a horrible burden, and his mother was forced to sell off some of that acreage. But even this did not end their financial troubles. Because she could only work part-time, Jim's mother had not been able to keep up on the property taxes for so much land. They owned about 50 acres still, down to an inlet south of their home. Sandra sometimes felt that it would be far easier to just sell everything and buy a house in town. But when she reflected on the fact that Jim was the last of the family with the name Monroe, and that the family had been on this land for hundreds of years, she kept trying to work out a way to stay. She had not been born a Monroe. She did not feel right making that kind of decision for Jim. When he was grown, he could move away if he wanted, but she did not want the responsibility of trying to explain to him why she had not kept their land. And so she determined to remain until there were no choices left. Their property taxes had been in arrears for several years, and they had another court date scheduled in several weeks' time. The judge had said at the last hearing that he was very sorry, but that if payment of $5,000 was not made to the county clerk by the next hearing, then the government would have to take direct action to collect their back taxes. That meant seizure of the property, she was sure. The judge had said he was sorry, but Sandra didn't think he looked sorry. His name was Jonas Beard, and he was a very important man in their small community. He now served as judge, and before that he had spent many years on the school board. But for all his apparent public spirit, he was still a puffy and self-important man. There were no relatives to help them, and no one to borrow money from. But one day, Sandra had an idea. The attic contained a few notable family heirlooms, objects she would never part with. But the attic also contained much older furniture, significant to no one, but which might attract the attention of antique dealers. So she decided to have a sale and emptied most of the furniture out of the attic down into the garage. The dark wood attic now seemed enormous and very dusty, and it somehow looked older and far less familiar than it had been before. When they had cleared everything out, Jim and his mother found a trunk of old books in a back corner. Most of them were history books, but there were also a few books of theology and some old grammars. Sandra gave Jim the job of sorting out any books that he might want and to set the others aside for the sale. And that is how Jim found the old letter in the attic on a very rainy day. On both ends of the attic, small windows opened up to a gray sky, and Jim did not know why, but all of it seemed very appropriate. As he rummaged through the box, the title of one book caught his attention immediately. It was called A General History of Pirates by a Captain Robert Johnson. The date of publication was 1852, but the book had been written a century before that. The pages on the side had that rough cut which old books sometimes have. Jim started to read through it and felt the familiar lump of excitement well up in his throat. But then he remembered he had a job to do and reluctantly set the book aside to take down to his room later. But as he did so, he noticed a piece of paper sticking out the side, near the back of the book. At first he thought it was one of the rough-cut pages that had come loose. But when he looked closer and opened the volume again, he saw that it was an old letter. He gently opened it. There were 5 or 6 pages to it, and the paper was water-stained and yellow. The paper creaked when it opened, and Jim had to handle it gingerly. In places the ink was smudged by the water, but fortunately most of it was legible. It took him a few moments to figure out who had written the letter and who had received it, but the date on it was 1935, and the name of the recipient was Leonard, and the one who had written it was your affectionate grandfather. Jim's father's name was Leonard. There was no last names anywhere. For all Jim could assume at that moment, it was just an old newsy letter to his father that would make his mother cry. But even so, before he read a word of it, he knew that it was far more important than this. When he thought about the moment of discovery later, he concluded that his knowledge came from a combination of the gray sky, the pirate book the letter was in, and the desperate circumstances he and his mother were in. It was just a pirate kind of day, he explained to me later. So it was probably a letter to his father, written when his father was a boy, and it was written to him by his grandfather. The letter was telling him how the family fortune had been made back in the first part of the 1700s, and it had been quite a fortune. Dear Leonard, the letter began. But of course now I have to back up for a moment. This letter that Jim found certainly did not contain everything that I am about to tell you, but the letter did lead to a number of other discoveries, and during the course of these discoveries, many other interesting facts came to light. For example, Jim's mother remembered some things her father-in-law had once said, things she had not understood at the time. She also found some interesting written comments made in some old family histories and genealogies. And a few of the family members in the early years have even been important enough to have had biographies written about them, and Sandra carefully read through them, trying to piece things together. Jim, for his part, not only had found the letter in the book, but also was able to contribute what he knew about pirates. And he also played a very important role later on, which I will have to tell you about when we get to that place in the story. So though I suppose I could tell you the story as it came out for them, in dribs and drabs, I do not think that is really the best way to do it. Although it was very exciting for them at the time, it would be very poor storytelling on my part indeed. And so I have decided to tell you all the facts as they looked once they were finally sorted out and placed in a proper order. I suppose I should introduce myself as well. I was a friend of Jim's father in the war, and after the war, I looked in on Sandra and Jim from time to time to see how they were getting on. At first I did this because of my friendship with Leonard and a sense of duty, I suppose. But as time went on, I found that I had a keen interest in Sandra, but all that had already started some time before this adventure started. Nevertheless, because of it, I was close enough to the whole thing to be able to tell you the details of the story. And so I suppose I had better get to it now.